Chapter 8 War. After scouts reported with absolute certainty that the attacking army had long since retreated down the mountain, Rashida announced that she would take a party with food and medicine down to give succor to the survivors. Halima, anxious to help, volunteered to accompany her. Together they crossed the great rope bridge and headed down toward the village. They were followed by a dozen donkeys loaded with provisions, led by boys too young for war. They passed through the hidden pass, a maze of narrow, twisting passages betwixt granite boulders. Halima had been blindfolded when the hunters had brought her this way before. Now she could see why it was kept secret. To those who did not know the way, it presented an impenetrable barrier to the upper reaches of the mountain. Descending the mountain was far quicker than climbing it. Soon they reached the outskirts of the village, which was hidden among a cluster of giant trees. Long before they arrived in the village, they saw vultures circling about it. They heard the wailing of women, singing of anger and grief. The smell came next, the unmistakable stench of blood. They rode solemnly into the village, Halima's donkey a few paces behind the queen's. Her eyes widened as she saw the desolation. Houses had been toppled, roofs burned, nothing intact. All the young men had been butchered, all the young women in the village taken captive, and the cattle stolen. The only ones left were the elders and a few squalling children. Somehow the survivors had managed to drag the bodies of the slain men and lay them in one neat line. 50 or 60 of them lay side by side like sleeping brothers. Halima heard an evil squawk above her and saw a vulture descend to peck at a corpse. One of the old bent men shuffled forward and shooed it angrily away. Rashida whispered to Halima, "Wait here. I must find the head woman of the village." Halima nodded and remained on her donkey, which shifted restlessly from foot to foot. The old giantesses knelt in a circle beside the corpses, swaying together like mournful elephants. They wailed, "We will never see our daughters again, the children that we carried in our wombs. We will never see our husbands again. We will die alone." Halima shivered, sharing their pain. Soon I might be a widow, she thought grimly. She climbed off her donkey, went over to one of the bearer boys, and collected a basket full of fresh melons. She walked down the line, giving nourishment to any of the women who would take it. One wailing giantess, who was about Halima's height even when kneeling, turned. Her red, teary eyes bugged out of her head, giving her a look of madness. "I know who you are. You are the wife of King Shmari. I was at your wedding feast." Halima nodded uncertainly, not relishing the touch of the woman's talons. The woman called to the others, "Look who is here! The princess from Kali, here to mock us." She knocked the basket of fruit from Halima's hand, and the melons rolled in all directions. The bug-eyed woman stood up and loomed over Halima menacingly. "Do you know it is your people who have murdered our men and stolen our children? Look at their corpses, already rotting." Other women stood up and picked up the cry. "Go back to your pretty palace in Calais! Begone, strumpet!" Halima looked down at the kneeling women helplessly. "Have you nothing to say?" the bug-eyed woman demanded. Halima stared at the woman's frog-like eyes, unable to muster a reply. "I am sorry, truly," she said finally. The bug-eyed woman gave a choked laugh. "Sorry she is. The Kalian should die." Pieces of half-eaten melon sailed through the air and splattered across Halima's robe. Halima tore herself out of the bug-eyed woman's grip and stood back in anger. "Bitch!" an anguished voice cried. Halima saw a rock the size of a fist hurtling toward her eyes. She jerked her head out of the way, but the stone grazed her cheek. She felt blood running like teardrops from the wound. The women began scrambling on the ground, looking for more stones. They cursed her, "Outlander! Devil!" Halima turned to run, crouching low and shielding her breasts. She sprinted a few yards, then smashed into a towering form. The vengeful harpies instantly ceased their cries for blood. Halima looked up to see Rashida facing the women down. Taller than any of them, she stood with her hands on her hips, nostrils flaring. Halima hugged her co-wife tightly, burying her face into her bosom. The first wife raised her cloak, shielding the girl from view. With the other hand, she pointed an accusatory finger. Hotly, Rashida called to the women, "What is this madness? Are you women of the mountain, or are you beasts of the jungle? Is this how you honor your dead, with shameful violence? If your grief is so great, then cast yourself on the funeral pyre and burn with your husbands, but do not seek to sacrifice a child who has never harmed you." Shamefacedly, the women dropped the stones. Rashida smiled coldly. Then, with iron in her voice, she commanded, "Now, kneel before the wives of King Shamari." The proud women stood facing her sourly. Rashida's voice grew more strident. "Kneel, I say. We are on an errand of mercy, but if you defy us, I swear to you that our husband's army will return and finish the havoc the enemy has wrought here." One by one, the women, shoulders slumping, sank to their knees, until even the bug-eyed woman knelt before them, head bowed in submission. Said Rashida, "Go then, and bury your dead, and answer your hurt with prayer, as is the way of the Abanca." On the ride back to the city, they rode together on Rashida's horse, Halima clinging to her, unable to unclench her fingers from her cloak. In her ears still rang the cruel names the hill people had called her. She still stung from their blows, and worse, their searing hatred. Rashida rode proudly erect, as if completely unaware of the shivering girl who sat in front of her, nestled in her bosom. When they were safely inside the compound, and in the first wife's house, Halima took the other woman's hands and knelt before her. Rashida protested, "You don't need to kneel before me. You are a free woman." "I kneel out of respect for you. You are as brave as any warrior. You saved my life." Rashida shrugged uncomfortably. "You saved the life of our son. I owed you a life? Consider it a debt paid." Halima bowed her head. "My mother is gone. May I call you mother now, as some of the other wives do?" Rashida looked down at the kneeling girl, her sternness melting. She reached out hesitantly and touched Halima's bald head. She was about to speak when Kiza ran in. "The men are returning," the buck-toothed servant announced with excitement. Like a tidal wave, an army of warriors of the Abaka marched toward the city gates, waving their spears above their heads and singing of their victory. Women converged on them, each looking for her son or husband. Shamari led the march, with his eldest son Hassani by his side. His robes were drenched in the blood of the enemy, but he walked unscathed. Hassani puffed up his bare chest and waved his still-dripping sword through the air. "How many men did I strike down, father? Was it 20, or more than that?" Shamari looked at him sternly. "Do not count fallen men as if they were sheep we have slaughtered." Hassani bowed his head in shame. "This is a game you will quickly grow tired of, my son," Shamari told him. The king saw his wives waiting for him at the city gate. Before he greeted his first wife, or any of the others, he embraced Halima. "I am not accustomed to this kind of war," he told her. "We have always battled for a few head of cattle, and we try to harm as few people as possible. Not this carnage." "Yes, you told me," Halima said. He seemed to almost be weeping. Had they not won the battle? All the other men were cheering and singing like any other army she'd ever seen return in victory. Then it dawned on her that something was missing. "Where are your prisoners?" she asked. Shamari shook his head. "We took no prisoners. We let none escape. They were testing our strength. We must let the enemy think the party they sent disappeared from the face of the earth." Shamari reached into his pouch and pulled out a sea turtle medallion, the symbol of the royal clan of Kali. It was identical to the one she once wore. He handed it to her solemnly. "I'm sorry. I know this man must have been your kin." Halima grasped the medallion numbly. Men and their horrible wars, she thought bitterly. Then she had a flash of insight. "Shamari, let me go to Kali, the land of my father. This bloodshed, it is mad. Our people are not warlike folk. It must all be a mistake, a misunderstanding." Shamari shook his head. "It is no misunderstanding, little one. When we engaged the enemy on the battlefield, their war leader, who wore that symbol, told me the king of Kali himself had sent them, that our people, the Abaka, must submit to his rule, or else taste destruction." Halima shook her head in confusion. She could not imagine her gentle father sending such a cruel message. "And how did you answer him, husband?" Shamari pointed to the blood in his robes. "By shedding his blood and all with him." Halima bowed her head. "Is it over then, husband?" "No, we have only now touched spears with the enemy. Now the war begins in earnest."